My mother died on a Thursday in March and left me everything she had. It was not a fortune. It was a modest house, a small savings account, and a handwritten letter that said she hoped the money would give me a softer life than she had been able to give me growing up. I read that letter at the kitchen table and I cried for an hour. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the drawer next to my bed where I kept the things that mattered most. 14 months later, the money was gone. Every dollar. And my husband's name was on every single transaction that had emptied it. I did not find this out because I was snooping. I found it out because a man I had never met knocked on my front door on a Wednesday afternoon, introduced himself as the husband of a woman named Priya, and said 7 words that I still hear sometimes when I am trying to sleep. He said, "I think our spouses are destroying us both." He was holding a folder. He said it was vast. He was not exaggerating. What happened after I let that man into my kitchen changed the entire direction of my life. And by the time it was over, my husband understood something that I do not think he had ever truly believed about me. He understood that a quiet woman is not the same thing as a weak one. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something real. When the person who is supposed to protect you becomes the person you most need protection from, what do you do with that? Not the anger part. The grief part. The part where you realize the life you thought you were living was built on something false. Stay with that question, because that is what this story is actually about. And if you have ever loved someone who was quietly taking from you while you were busy trusting them, you are going to feel every single word of what comes next. My name is Luna. I am 43 years old. I have been a careful person my whole life. Careful with money, careful with words, careful with trust. My mother raised me that way. She was a woman who had been left alone with 2 children and very little else when my father walked out, and she spent the rest of her life making sure I understood that the ground could shift under you at any moment, and that the only reliable thing in this world was what you had prepared for yourself. She saved for 40 years in small amounts. She drove the same car until it stopped moving. She bought clothes at end-of-season sales. She packed her lunch every single day of her working life. She did all of this so that when she died, she could leave something real behind for me and my brother Daniel. Something that said, "I was here, I worked, I loved you, and I wanted your life to be a little easier than mine." She died of a heart condition that had been building quietly for years, the way so many things build quietly before they arrive all at once. She was 67. I held her hand. She knew I was there. The estate was not complicated. A house in the town where she had lived for 30 years sold for $212,000. A savings account with $44,000 in it. Some personal belongings, divided between Daniel and me according to the handwritten list she had kept in her filing cabinet, because she was exactly that kind of organized woman. My share of the estate after Daniel's portion and the costs came to $131,000. $131,000, and a letter that said she hoped it would give me a softer life. My husband's name was Garrett. We had been married for 9 years at that point. He was charming in the way that some men are charming, the way that makes you feel warm and chosen when it is directed at you, and only later makes you realize that the warmth was a tool rather than a truth. He had a good job in commercial lending. He dressed well. He knew how to talk to people. At dinner parties, he was the man everyone wanted to sit next to, and I used to feel proud of that, the way you feel proud of a beautiful thing you believe belongs to you. When my mother died, Garrett was attentive and present in a way that I found genuinely comforting. He came to the funeral. He helped me sort through her belongings. He was patient when I cried, which was often in those first weeks. He said all the right things about her. He said she was a remarkable woman. He said her sacrifices showed in who I had become. He held my hand at the grave, and I thought, in that moment of raw grief, that I was fortunate to have a man like this beside me. I do not know exactly when he started. I have thought about the timeline many times since, and I think it is possible he started thinking about the money before my mother was even fully buried. I think that thought, now that I know who he really is, does not surprise me. But at the time, I had no reason to think anything except that my husband was a man who loved me and was grieving with me. The inheritance money was deposited into my personal account, WH. I had maintained since before our marriage. Luna, not Luna and Garrett. My mother had left it to me specifically, and I had been clear about wanting to keep it in my own name. Garrett had said that was completely reasonable. He had said he understood. He had said it was my mother's money, and it should stay where she intended it. About 3 weeks after the money arrived, Garrett started mentioning a new investment opportunity. He had been approached, he said, by a colleague about a commercial real estate development project. The returns were going to be significant. The window was narrow. He said he was putting some of his own money in and he thought it was a smart move for our long-term financial security. I asked the questions a careful person asks. He had answers for all of them. He had a prospectus. He had names I could not verify, but that sounded credible. He had projections on paper. He was calm and knowledgeable the way he always was when he talked about financial things, and I trusted his expertise the way I had trusted it throughout our marriage. I transferred $30,000 from my inheritance account into our joint account at his request. He said the investment was going in from the joint account for simplicity. I agreed. I was still deep in grief. I was not thinking as sharply as I normally would have. I signed a transfer authorization that I did not read as carefully as I should have. I want to say that clearly. I did not read it carefully enough. And I have had to forgive myself for that, because blame directed inward is the thing that keeps women like me stuck, and I refuse to stay stuck. That was the beginning, but it was not the end. Over the next 8 months, Garrett came to me 4 more times with variations of the same conversation. Each time there was a new reason, a new opportunity, a new urgent window. A bridge loan needed to close a commercial deal. A tax-advantaged vehicle that required a minimum investment. A short-term liquidity need that he would cover back within 90 days. He was always calm, always reasonable, always fluent in the language of financial logic that I respected but did not fully understand myself. By the time 14 months had passed since my mother's death, I had transferred a total of $119,000 out of my inheritance account. Of the $131,000 my mother left me, $12,000 remained. $12,000 out of 40 years of careful saving and one small house and everything she worked for. I did not know this yet. I want to be clear about that. I did not know the full number. I had not added it all up. Each transfer had felt like a single decision, a considered choice, a reasonable response to a credible explanation. I had not sat down and looked at them all together. The reason I found out was because of a Wednesday afternoon and a man named Vincent. Vincent knocked on my door at 2:15 on a Wednesday in May. I remember the time because I had just sat down with tea and a book and the knock startled me. I was working from home that day. I went to the door and found a man I had never seen before. He was about 45, average height, dressed neatly in a way that suggested he had come from work. His face was not angry. It was exhausted. The kind of exhausted that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and finally deciding to put it down. He told me his name was Vincent. He told me his wife's name was Priya. He told me he had reason to believe that our spouses had been in a relationship for approximately 14 months. He said he was sorry to bring this to my door. He said he had gone back and forth about whether to come for several weeks. He said he had ultimately decided that whatever I did with the information was my choice, but that not telling me was something he could not live with. He was holding a manila folder. He asked if he could come inside. I let him in. I made him tea. My hands were steady. I was not yet in the place of feeling because I had not yet understood what I was being told. I was still in the place of processing, of listening, of being the careful, controlled woman my mother raised me to be, even when the ground was shifting. Vincent sat at my kitchen table and opened the folder. What was in that folder was not something I will describe in every detail because some of it is deeply personal and some of it is not mine to make public. But I will tell you the shape of it. There were photographs, not intimate ones, but photographs of Garrett and a woman in places where a married man going to work does not typically go. Restaurants. A weekend trip that Garrett had told me was a client conference in another city. A parking lot outside an apartment building that Vincent said was where Priya had been staying during the stretches she told him she was visiting her sister. There were phone records. Vincent had paid for a service that documented call frequency and duration. Garrett's number and Priya's number had been in contact hundreds of times in the previous 14 months, at hours that made the nature of the contact unmistakable. There was also a bank statement. Priya's, not Garrett's. Vincent had found it in her things 3 weeks ago. It showed a series of deposits over the past year, regular and substantial, from an account that Vincent did not recognize. He had traced the account number as far as he was able before hitting a wall, and what he had found was that the account appeared to be a secondary account in Garrett's name, not the account he and I shared, a separate account I had no knowledge of. The deposits into Priya's account totaled, across the year, a little over $74,000. I sat at my kitchen table with Vincent, and I looked at that number on that bank statement, and I felt the room tilt slightly, the way a room tilts when your body understands something before your mind has finished processing it. $74,000. Into his mistress's account. In the same period that he had moved $119,000 out of my inheritance. I thanked Vincent. I asked him what he was planning to do. He said he had already filed for divorce and his attorney was handling the financial side. He said Priya had not yet been served because his attorney wanted certain documents in order first. He said he was telling me because he felt I deserved the same chance he had taken, the chance to act before the other side knew that I knew. I asked him if I could keep copies of the documents in the folder. He said he had made them for me. He had brought them specifically for me. He had known when he came to my door that morning that I would need them. I walked Vincent to the door. I shook his hand. I told him I was sorry for what he was going through, and I meant it because the pain in his face was real and familiar to me now in a way it had not been 20 minutes earlier. He nodded. He said he hoped things worked out for me. He left. I went back to my kitchen. I sat down. I picked up my tea, which had gone cold. I set it back down. I sat very still for approximately 10 minutes, and then I picked up my phone and I called my attorney. Her name was Sylvia. I had used her once before, years ago, for a small contract dispute that had come to nothing. I had kept her number because my mother always told me to keep the number of a good attorney the way you keep the number of a good doctor, because you do not need them until you need them very badly. Sylvia answered on the third ring. I told her what I had just learned. I told her about the inheritance, the transfers, the timeline, the folder, the secondary account, the deposits into Priya's account. I spoke for about 8 minutes without stopping. Sylvia did not interrupt. When I finished, she said, "Luna, do not touch anything in any account. Do not confront your husband tonight. Do not let him know you know." "Can you do that?" I said I could. She said she needed 48 hours to file some preliminary motions and to get a financial forensics referral moving. She said she was going to send me a list of things to do before I went to sleep that night. She said the most important thing right now was that I had time and he did not know I had it. I said I understood. I sat in my house that Wednesday evening and waited for Garrett to come home. He came home at 6:40, which was normal. He kissed me on the cheek, which was normal. He asked about my day, and I said it was quiet, which was a true statement delivered in a tone that gave him nothing. He made a drink and sat on the couch and scrolled his phone, and I watched him from the kitchen doorway for a moment. This man I had been married to for 9 years, and I thought about my mother's letter in the drawer by my bed, and I felt something harden in me with a quietness that surprised even me. I did not sleep much that night. I spent most of it going through every account I had access to and making a full accounting, for the first time, of every transfer I had authorized over the previous 14 months. $119,000. I wrote every one down in a notebook, date by date, amount by amount. Then I wrote 12,000 at the bottom, which was what remained. Then I opened Sylvia's email, which had arrived at 10:47 that night, and I followed her list precisely. I did not miss a single item. Over the next week, while Garrett went to work and came home and kissed me on the cheek and had no idea that anything had changed, Sylvia was moving. She filed for a financial freeze on the joint marital assets. She engaged a forensic accountant named Dr. Patricia Wren, who specialized in marital financial fraud. She sent a formal request to 3 banks for records related to accounts held by Garrett, including the secondary account Vincent had identified. She also connected me with a divorce attorney. Why in her network, a woman named Constance, who was described to me as someone who was very good at cases involving hidden assets. I met Constance for the first time on a Friday morning, 8 days after Vincent's visit. She was direct and unhurried, and she had the kind of calm that comes from having sat across from many people in the worst moment of their lives and knowing exactly how to help them move through it. She reviewed everything I had brought her: the notebook, the folder from Vincent, the account statements, the transfers. She told me several things that I needed to hear clearly and without comfort. She told me that what Garrett had done, moving money from my personal inheritance account through a series of authorized transfers under false pretenses, met the legal definition of financial fraud within a marriage in our state. She told me that the secondary account and the deposits to Priya's account, once fully documented, would constitute compelling evidence of both the affair and the financial abuse. She told me that the investment story, the prospectus, the projections, the various justifications he had used, all of it would need to be traced and documented, but that if the investments did not exist or were fabricated, that was fraud, plain and simple. She also told me that Garrett was likely to fight hard. Men who did what he had done rarely went quietly, she said. They usually had a story ready. They usually had an alternate version of the financial transfers that cast them as reasonable and the money as jointly used for marital purposes. She wanted me to be prepared for that. She wanted me to be steady when I heard his version, because I would hear it, and it would be designed to make me feel confused and unreasonable. I told Constance something that I want to say here because I think it matters. I told her that the thing I was most afraid of was not the fight. I was not afraid of Garrett's version. I was not afraid of the legal process, or the difficulty, or even the financial damage that had already been done. What I was most afraid of was the grief of it. The grief of being the woman who had sat at her mother's grave holding her husband's hand, while her husband was already planning to take her mother's money. The grief of that specific picture, that was the thing that had the power to undo me. Constance looked at me for a moment and then she said, "That grief is real and it belongs to you, but it is not going to help you in this room. Save it for somewhere safe and then come back here ready to work." She said it without coldness, just clarity. I appreciated that more than any soft comfort would have offered. I saved the grief for my therapist, a woman named Dr. Holloway, whom I had started seeing 2 weeks after Vincent's visit. Dr. Holloway let me feel every part of it in a room where feeling it would not cost me anything strategic. That is what therapy was for me in those months. A place where I could be devastated without consequence, so that everywhere else I could be functional and clear. 3 weeks into the legal process, Dr. Wren, the forensic accountant, delivered her preliminary report. The investment opportunities Garrett had described to me did not exist. Not in any verifiable form. The prospectus he had shown me for the commercial real estate project had been created in a software program designed for making presentation documents. The entity names on the prospectus matched no registered business entities in our state or the adjoining ones. The colleague he had cited as the source of the opportunity had, when quietly checked by Constance's investigator, no knowledge of any such project. $119,000 had been moved through a carefully constructed fiction. Of that money, Dr. Wren was able to trace, through the secondary account and other pathways, approximately $81,000. 44,000 had gone to Priya's account directly. 22,000 had been spent on what the records showed as travel, restaurants, hotels, and gifts over 14 months. 15,000 had gone into what appeared to be a personal brokerage account in Garrett's name alone, an account I had not known existed, where the money had been invested in a modest portfolio that was now worth approximately $17,000. $38,000 remained unaccounted for in Dr. Wren's preliminary report. She said she expected to close most of that gap in the full report. I sat with those numbers in Constance's office, and I thought about my mother packing her lunch. Every day. For decades. Packing her lunch so she did not spend the $3. I thought about her end-of-season sales and her 40-year-old car and her handwritten list in the filing cabinet. I thought about the letter that said she wanted my life to be softer. I did not cry in Constance's office. I had made a decision very early in this process that my emotions were not going to be spent where they could be used against me. I waited until I was in my car in the parking garage, and then I sat there for about 15 minutes, and then I drove to Dr. Holloway's office, which I had not scheduled but which she made time for because that is the kind of person she was, and I sat in her office and I cried for the full hour. When the hour was done, I felt emptied out in the way that is actually clean rather than exhausting. I drove home. I made dinner. Garrett came home and kissed me on the cheek, and I asked about his day with a face that showed him nothing. He still did not know that I knew. Constance had told me the timing of serving him mattered. She wanted to file and serve him in the same window, the same day if possible, so that he had no warning and no time to move any remaining assets before the freeze was in place. She was working with Sylvia to make sure the financial protections were locked before he had any reason to react. The day came on a Thursday morning in July, about 6 weeks after Vincent's visit. I had been told the night before that everything was ready. I went to work that morning as normal. I sat at my desk and I worked through my emails and I answered my calls and I did my job, which is what I had always done, which is what my mother had always done, and which no one and nothing was ever going to take from me. At 11:15 that morning, Garrett was served at his office. Constance had chosen his office deliberately. Not cruelly, she was clear about that, but strategically. A man served at his workplace, in front of colleagues, with a petition that listed financial fraud alongside adultery and marital misconduct, is a man who immediately understands that the situation is serious, is a man who cannot simply go home that evening and manage his wife's perception of events, is a man who has to call a lawyer immediately from a place where people can see him doing it. He called me at 11:47. I did not answer. He called again at 12:03. I did not answer. He sent a text at 12:15. It said, "Luna, we need to talk. Please call me." I did not reply. At 2 in the afternoon, I received a call from a number I did not recognize, which turned out to be Garrett's attorney, a man named Brian. Brian said his client was requesting an urgent conversation before things escalated further. I told Brian that all communication should go through my attorney Constance and gave him her number. Then I hung up. I want to be honest about something. The 6 hours after Garrett was served were not hours of triumph for me. They were not satisfying in the way people might expect. They were very quiet hours, heavy hours. I sat at my desk, and I did my work, and I felt the weight of 9 years ending, not with a fight or a scene, but with a legal document delivered by a process server to a man who was apparently eating lunch at his desk when it arrived. 9 years. I thought about the early years when I had believed in him fully, when his warmth had felt real, when I had thought we were building something honest together. I thought about whether any of it had been real. I thought about the version of myself who had held his hand at my mother's grave. I thought about her, and I felt a tenderness toward her that I had not expected, a soft, fierce protectiveness toward the woman I had been before I knew. Garrett came home that evening. He had a key. I had not changed the locks yet. Constance had advised waiting until formal separation was documented, so he came in, and he sat at the kitchen table where Vincent had sat 6 weeks earlier, and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something stripped of the charm, something that was trying very hard to calculate the right approach and not finding one. He said he could explain the money. He said the investments were real but had restructured and the paperwork was complicated. He said the account I had been told about was something he had been planning to tell me about. He said Priya was not what I thought she was. He said he had made mistakes, but the picture I had been given was not the whole picture. He said he loved me. He said he did not want to lose our marriage over something that could be worked through. I listened to all of it. I let him say every word. I did not interrupt. I did not show him anything in my face. When he was finished, I said 3 sentences. I said my attorney's name was Constance, and her number was on the petition he had received that morning. I said I would be staying at a hotel for the next several nights to give us both space to think. I said I hoped he would get good legal advice. Then I picked up the bag I had packed that morning before work and I walked out of my house. I stayed at the hotel for 4 nights. I ordered room service the first night, a thing I almost never did, and I watched movies in bed, and I let myself exist in a space that was completely mine and completely quiet. And completely free of the performance of normalcy that I had been maintaining for 6 weeks. It felt like putting down a very heavy bag that I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten I was carrying it. The legal process took 8 months from service to settlement. I am not going to walk through every detail because it was, as Constance had warned me, a fight. Garrett did what she said men like him always did. He had a version. His version was that the transfers had been authorized by me for joint purposes, that I had been an active participant in the financial decisions, that the investments had been real but had failed, that the money was lost rather than stolen. His attorney Brian was competent and thorough and tried his best with what he had. What he had was not enough. Dr. Wren's full report, when it was complete, was 53 pages. It traced $94,000 of the $119,000 to specific destinations, all of them personal, none of them investment-related, many of them directly associated with Priya or with Garrett's personal accounts. The prospectus was proven to be fabricated. The entity names were proven to be unregistered. The colleague he had cited signed an affidavit stating He had no knowledge of any investment and had never spoken to Garrett about one. Vincent's documents, admitted as evidence with his cooperation, established the affair timeline precisely. The phone records showed contact beginning 2 weeks after my mother's funeral. 2 weeks. The first transfer of inheritance money had come 3 weeks after that. Constance presented the timeline to Garrett's attorney in a mediation session that I was not present for. She told me afterward that when Brian saw the full timeline laid out, the phone records beginning 2 weeks after the funeral, the first transfer 3 weeks after that, he went very quiet. She said that was the moment she knew they would settle. The settlement was not everything I had lost. Settlements rarely are, but it was substantial. Garrett agreed to a judgment against him for $104,000, representing the documented traced funds minus what had already been recovered from his brokerage account. The marital home, which I had moved back into after the separation, was awarded to me outright against the debt, which more than covered the remaining balance. He was required to vacate within 30 days. He also agreed, in the settlement, to a specific clause that Constance had insisted on and that I had signed off on with something that felt close to satisfaction. The clause stated that in any future legal proceeding related to this matter, he could not claim the transfers had been for investment purposes. He was, in legal terms, agreeing to the record of what had actually happened. He was signing his name to a document that said, "I took this money." He did not call it that. The language was formal and oblique, as legal language always is. But that was what it meant. The day he moved his things out of the house, I was at work. I came home that evening and walked through the rooms and looked at where his things had been, and I felt a quiet that was different from the quiet of the previous 8 months. The previous quiet had been the quiet of a woman holding herself together. This was the quiet of a woman standing in her own space, in her own life, with the knowledge that what she had built now belonged entirely to her. I found the letter from my mother in the drawer by the bed where I had kept it all along. I read it again for the first time since the early weeks of grief. She said she hoped the money would give me a softer life. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about that carefully. The money had not given me a softer life. It had, in fact, funded the most painful education of my life. It had been taken and spent on a woman I had never met and on dinners and hotels and a story about investments that had never existed. But here is what I also knew, sitting on that bed reading that letter. My mother had not left me money. She had left me clarity. The money had been the vehicle. The clarity was the inheritance. The clarity about who I had married, about what I had been willing to excuse, about the difference between a man who loved me and a man who had mastered the performance of loving me. That clarity was worth more than $131,000. I would not have traded it, not for the money, not for the comfortable marriage I thought I had, not for the life I thought I was living. I put the letter back in the drawer. I made dinner. I poured a glass of wine. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Vincent had sat, the same table where Garrett had sat and tried to explain his way out of a truth he had no language to explain. And I ate my dinner alone and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a woman who knew exactly where she was. Priya and Vincent's divorce. Settled 3 months before mine did. Vincent called me once after it was final. He asked how I was doing. I said I was getting there. He said he was too. We did not become friends in any ongoing way, but I think of him with a genuine warmth. He was a man who made a hard decision to do the right thing when the right thing cost him something. That is rarer than it should be. Priya sent me a message through a mutual connection about 4 months after everything was done, asking if I would be willing to talk. I thought about it for several days. I chose not to respond, not out of hatred. I did not hate Priya, but I had nothing to say to her that needed to be said, and I was at a point in my healing where I was very careful about what I let back into my space. I wished her nothing bad. I simply wished her elsewhere. Garrett tried to reach me twice after the settlement. Once by text, which I did not answer, and once through a mutual friend named Carol who called me and said Garrett had asked her to let me know he wanted to apologize. I told Carol that I appreciated her making the call and that my answer was no. Carol said she understood and she was sorry for what had happened. I said thank you. I meant it. My brother Daniel had known something about Garrett that he had never told me until the divorce was underway. He called me when the news was out and said there had been something about Garrett, a discomfort Daniel had never been able to name fully, something about the way Garrett talked about money and about other people's money, that had made Daniel uneasy from the beginning. Daniel said he had told himself it was just a personality difference and that it was not his place to say anything. He said he was sorry he had not trusted his instinct. I told Daniel I was not angry at him. I told him I had ignored my own instincts many times over those 9 years, and I was the one who had chosen to stay. Each time I had felt a small unease. Each time something had not added up, and I had decided it was easier to explain it away. I told him we had both done the thing that people who love their lives do. They protect the version of the life they want to believe in until they simply cannot anymore. Daniel took me to dinner that weekend. He paid for it without mentioning he was paying for it, which is the best way to pay for something. We talked about our mother. We talked about what she would have thought about all of this. We both agreed she would have been furious at Garrett in a very controlled and precise way, which was absolutely her style. We also both agreed she would have been proud of how I had handled it. I am still in the house. I made some changes after Garrett left. Not dramatic changes. I painted the kitchen a different color, a warm cream that I had wanted for years, and that Garrett had said was too bland. I put a small desk in the space where his reading chair had been, and I use it for my own reading and writing. The house is mine in a way it did not feel before, even though my name was on the deed from the beginning. Ownership is not just a legal fact. It is something you feel in your body when you walk through the rooms, and every single thing in them is chosen by you and for you. I started a small savings account in the first month after the settlement. I set an automatic transfer into it every month, a modest amount, nothing dramatic but regular and intentional. My mother's way. I think of it as honoring her. I think of the savings account as me telling her, I received the inheritance. Not the way either of us planned, but I received it. I am seeing someone now, a man I met through Daniel's wife's social circle, a quiet man named Philip who is a landscape architect and who talks about plants with a gentle enthusiasm that I find deeply restoring after the years of Garrett's high-performance charm. Philip does not perform. He is simply present. He says what he means. When he says he is going somewhere, he goes there. When he says he will call, he calls. I am not in a hurry with Philip. I am just in the room with him, which is enough for now, which is more than enough. Dr. Holloway and I still meet every other week. There is less urgency now and more reflection. She asked me recently what I thought the hardest part of the whole experience had been, not the legal process, not the financial damage, but the emotional core of it. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I told her the hardest part was the moment I understood that Garrett had held my hand at my mother's grave while already planning what he would do with her money. That specific image, that specific overlap of grief and betrayal. I said that image had taken the longest to stop being the first thing that came to my mind when I thought about those years. Dr. Holloway asked me if it still came to my mind. I said sometimes, less now than before. She asked what I did with it when it came. I said I had learned to set it down, not forget it, no. Pretend it did not happen, not minimize it, but set it down the way you set down something that is heavy and that you no longer need to carry everywhere. She nodded and said that was exactly right. It is exactly right. I know it is. Because I have felt the difference between carrying it and setting it down, and the difference is the difference between a life organized around a wound and a life that contains the wound but is not defined by it. My mother worked for 40 years and saved what she could and hoped it would soften my life. It did not soften it the way she imagined, but it gave me something she would recognize. It gave me the knowledge that I could survive something that would have broken some people. It gave me the clarity to see myself without the comfortable story I had been telling myself. It gave me Constance and Dr. Holloway and the quiet Tuesday evenings in my repainted kitchen and Philip talking about plants and a savings account growing in small, honest increments every month. It gave me my life back, my actual life, not the performed one. And for that, in a way that would have seemed impossible to explain on the day Vincent knocked on my door with his vast folder, I am grateful. I miss my mother every day. I still read her letter sometimes. The last line of it says, "You have always known how to land on your feet, Luna." I believe that still. She was right. I just needed a little time to prove it.